Recording.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Hey, Sidipton, hi, good morning. How are you?
Very good. Happy to see you present.
Oh,
Looking
thank
forward
you.
to this.
Well, I'm very happy to see you on the panel. Um, Thank you very much for logging
Okay.
on. Yeah.
Right. So I think that we can start, right? Okay. So let's start. This is Miguel Duro. I'm from IES Business School in Barcelona. Although this year I am at Harvard visiting, Harvard Business School. Let me introduce you to Paul Griffin, the paper Share Buybacks and Earnings Management, Replication and Extension. So I think this is going to be a very interesting presentation. I will suggest that we give him a little bit of time and interrupt it. Let's say, at least, 10 minutes, and he may extend it a little bit more so that he can set the stage. Basically, we can have a vigorous conversation. So I will appreciate that all of you mute yourself if you haven't done it already. If you have the possibility, it would be great to see your faces. And what we will do after this time that he will be setting the stage, I think it would be good that you raise your hand through the reaction part. Raise your hand because that will help me a lot. So don't use the chat because then it will be all over the place. So my suggestion is that you please raise your hand through the reaction. Okay, Paul, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think somebody needs to press record. Can somebody press record button? So we're on.
Yeah, it's already recorded. Is it recording?
Yeah. It's being recorded.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. Okay, everyone, good day, good morning, good evening from wherever you are. It's a real great pleasure to be part of the Accounting Design Project. This is the first for me, so I'm a little bit new to it. So bear with me if I don't quite follow all the sort of protocols that you've established over the years. But it's a great program. I've watched it over the years in terms of getting research sort of circulated, discussed, and for someone like me who's been around for eons, I think Josh Ronan is. I saw him on the list. I think Josh is probably the only person older than me on this. So my first publication was in 1968. Everyone, so that's an indication of being around for a while. But I love this. I love accounting research, and I'll continue to engage in different things, topics of interest. So it's really good in that sense. So what is the topic of interest today? Well, as you can see from that first slide, we're going to talk about buybacks. And if you want to use the formal term, we can talk about stock repurchases. But if you look at the media and the discussions and the narratives, it's mostly around buybacks. So I'll sort of continue to use that term. To set the stage, get us sort of on the right wavelength, so to speak, I'm going to go to my first slide here, and it's a report that came out. I just happened to notice that it showed up in Bloomberg a couple of weeks ago, and it was a headline. It was like Alibaba coming out with $25 billion worth of buybacks, and they've been on a buyback binge for quite some time, but this was just a new headline: $25 billion of buybacks, and just in the most recent fiscal year. So I went to the financials and looked up the data. The most recent fiscal year, 2023, it had added up payments or repurchase payments in US dollar terms of 10.9 billion. So I said, well, let me figure out, these are pretty large numbers. So let me figure out what the earnings impact of this is. So I went back to my calculator and did that sort of straightforward calculation where you look at the amount of share reduction, and the share reduction, this is number of shares, is 1.039. You can see that right there. And then you sort of look, well, what's the percentage of the reduction in total shares outstanding? And so I went back and looked at the beginning of the year shares outstanding, did a little back of the envelope calculation, about 4 to 5%. So this is a very substantial reduction in shares outstanding for a very large international sort of global firm. 4 to 5% reduction. So anyone would think, well, this is going to have a huge impact on earnings because you reduce that denominator quite a bit. So I said, well, let's do that. Let's do the standard calculation where we adjusted the denominator for the new or the lower number of shares, and we incorporate the cost of the buyback, and then we recompute the earnings per share as if no buyback had happened. So that's what I call the as if EPS. And that as if EPS would normally be lower because the buyback's meant to increase EPS. That's the sort of idea behind it. But anyway, getting to the end of the slide here, you can see there that we do that calculation. The amount of change, right? This is what I call the EPS minus as if EPS. That's the amount of increment in earnings per share is 0.0066. And you can do that on basic, you can do that on undiluted. And so that's less than a penny, that's 0.6 of 1 penny. So a major corporation, a lot of headlines on the buyback, but basically almost like nothing in terms of EPS. So that's the sort of thing that's been going on for decades now. So what I'm doing is try to put all of this into a larger picture and look at the full array of buybacks over an extended period. So let's go now to the actual paper itself, right? And there's the topic here: share buybacks and earnings management, replication extension. So we're going to do a little bit of replication, and we're going to extend. We're going to do a little bit of reproduction, as well as a little bit of extension. So sort of three things going on here. A replication and a reproduction, and then we're going to add a little further to the analysis. My co-author is David Blunt, he's down in New Zealand. So first of all, some background to all of this. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing replication extension? Well, as most of you know, out there, there's talk, there's discussion, there's ideas going on. Maybe there's a replication crisis. Maybe a lot of this work that gets published in all these top journals is not reproducible. And there's a couple of well-known papers. People have debated these papers at length, from what I understand. But the Campbell-Hardy one says it's 400 papers. You can't reproduce the results. Another paper by Lene Roberts can't reproduce the anomalies research. They show that there's positive after extension, abnormal returns. Can't do that. Another one that really interests me was this paper is not so much accounting, but other areas. This is Sarah Garcia and Kaniti. Studies that fail to replicate are cited more than those that replicate, and this is after they've been shown not to replicate. So they get even more citations. So I thought that was a little sort of interesting. And then there's some other papers. Steve Saltiero is writing about replications or reproductions are sort of done within articles, and said there's probably more going on than we are aware of. And so there's some pushback on that. But clearly, there are issues of replication, and so I want to be part of that discussion, and that's why we're presenting the work here. So let's go to the IQs. So the first one is this notion that there's been an increase in positive earnings surprises, over time. So that's sort of gradual increase. And there's several papers going back on that, and a more recent one that I published in JBFA sort of comes up with the same thing, but I wasn't the first person to identify this. And the question is whether that growth in earnings surprises can be explained in part by the growth in buybacks, which is clearly, been growing, at least in dollar monetary terms. You see, very large sums going, you add it all up, goes a trillion. So we're looking at that. And the second thing is that we're looking at this notion of whether buyback actually can be used as a purpose of managing earnings, that is, to move earnings from sort of small minuses around zero to small pluses. This is on the earnings surprise, to create sort of a higher probability of getting a positive earnings surprise. So that's the notion of earnings management we're looking at here. in terms of what I call street earnings. So that second question then is, do managers use buyback as a device to manage earnings? And there's a long literature here. There's several papers, and a lot of them sort of have a fairly common methodology, and we're sort of building on that methodology. So what do we find in all of this? Main findings. Item number one, the EPS boost from a buyback, or buybacks in general, does not explain this sort of tendency for earnings surprises to be growing and becoming more positive over time, and that trend doesn't seem to be disappearing or reversing or anything like that. So that's sort of main finding number one. And main finding number two is that there's lots of reasons to do buybacks, and you've seen that in literature. You can run down a list, lots of papers, provide incentive for compensation, maximize share value, and so forth. But the reason for buyback to sort of benefit and manage earnings is probably not one of them. So we're in a sense rejecting some of the earlier research that concluded that there was earnings management going on around buybacks. So this is on the first question. And most of what I'm going to talk about here is graphical. It's all backed up in the tables and so forth, but mostly I'm going to talk about and explain the graphs. So if you look at this one, this is figure 5 of the paper, and you can see on the y-axis, right, the y-axis is the EPS boost to as if earnings surprise. So it's the amount of boost from the buyback as a ratio, percentage of the earnings surprise, not earnings, but the earnings surprise as a percentage. And you can see overall, it means that percentage is low, like 2% at the max, running between sort of 1% and 2%. So it's a very, very small portion of the earnings surprise. All right. But you can see also that the green columns are relatively stable. There's no clear trend up or down. So that's sort of message number one from that graph. Message number two is to look at the trend of earnings surprise. Right, this is just regular trend, not adjusted or anything like that. And you can look at the orange line. The orange line are those that fall just below zero. Right, it's from -1 cent to zero, right, just below zero. And that line, the orange line, is sort of going down over time. That's been shown in other work, so there's nothing new there, but it's kind of a confirmation of that trend. And if you look at the earnings surprises just above zero, like between 0 and 1 cent, that's the gray line just above the orange line. You can see that that's been going down too. And a lot of people say, well, yeah, well, we know that that's been published before. Maybe Sarbanes-Oxley was accounting for that and some other reasons, more monitoring of earnings management and so forth, particularly if like what we call accrual earnings management. And the purple line, those are earnings surprises between, what is it, between 1 cent and 5. So they're not the small ones, but they're not the huge ones. It's sort of in the middle there. That's been sort of steady or going down a little bit. But so the only trend that you see in those earnings surprises going up, right? The only trend that's going up is the blue line, and those are the ones above 5 cents and up. The range I've got in that is between 5 cents and $1. Right? So some of those are pretty big earnings surprises. So that's one thing going up. So the message of this paper is that the trend of earnings surprises does not seem to be accounted for by the trend of how much of the earnings surprise is accounted for by the contribution of the buyback, right? So that's sort of message number one. And in some ways, it's a non-result. So it's saying that the reason for that trend is not because of buyback. So it's we could call it a negative result in that sense. Okay, so now we're going into the replication extension. And again, graphical analysis is the way we're going to look at this. And so what we're looking at here is the distribution of the EPS boost, right? Doing that standard calculation, and we can do that for accredited buybacks, we can do that for non-accredited buybacks using the standard formula for what's accredited. That's the EP ratio. It's got to be what is it, greater than R, whatever that opportunity cost rate return. So that's a sort of standard formula. So we separate the buyback population sample we have into accredited and non-accredited. So this is the one for accredited. So these are the ones that are likely, more likely than not, to increase earnings per share having positive buyback boost. And you can see there that going across the x-axis, that's going from 0, right, to going from 0 over here. So over here, this is 1 cent, not $1, 1 cent, right? So this is the distribution going from 0 to 1 cent, and you can see that up to 1.121%. You add these percentages up, that's roughly 50%. So 50% of the buyback boost, 50% are in that range of 0.02, or that's 2% of 1 cent to 14% of 1 cent. They're incredibly small amounts, and of course there are a few over here. This is more than 1 cent, and there can be a few more out here that are greater than 1 cent, but those numbers are really small. So the idea behind that is the distribution is mostly restricted to EPS boost of well under 1 cent, it could be less than 1 cent, but it could give you a 1 cent plus through rounding error on the EPS calculation, and we'll come to that soon. Okay, so, yeah, I have a question.
Okay, I mean, there is a question by Steve Penman. If you think that you have already set the stage, I mean, we can address it. Or if not, we can give you a little bit of more time. It's up to you.
Stephen, do you have a...
Yeah, Paul, I just want to be clear on how you're doing this, the effect of repurchases on earnings per share. The number for two-thirds of a penny for Alibaba seemed very low. So how do you do the calculation? So if in fact they pay it out of cash, which they do, okay, and the interest rate on cash is very, very low, okay, after tax, then the denominator doesn't decrease much. There's a big increase in the numerator doesn't change much, but a big increase in the denominator. So are these actually analytical calculations that you go through, or is it the after the fact effect on earnings per share, which would include other factors going on?
Well, I went back to the Alibaba financials, and what's interesting is that their most recent financials follow the latest SEC ruling, where you have to do it month by month in terms of the timing of the. So that was actually helpful, because you can do a proper weighted calculation on EPS in terms of the timing of the repurchases, right? Because the ones that occurred like in the last month of the year, they have almost no weighting in terms of the denominator, right? So I did that calculation, and so everything is done on a weighted basis using the detailed data that they presented in their financials. Again, I think you're right there. You've got a fairly large reduction in shares, but you don't have much on the other side in terms of the benefit to earnings. So that's
well, earnings reduces in the numerator, right? Because you're paid out cash.
Yeah.
And it only reduces by the after-tax interest you're earning on the cash, which in these periods, I don't know about China, are pretty low. So it seems strange. But when you go from the stock repurchase to the next earnings per share, is it the earnings per share? There's intervening things happen during that time, okay? So it could be that just a correlation is that you have a stock repurchase and your business is not as good as it was before, okay?
Absolutely. I mean, given there's a repurchase, business could be conducted differently versus not there be no repurchase, right? So the incentives can change and so forth. I understand that, but I'm not trying to adjust for that. And as I said, I'm following the pretty standard formula. And you can look back at prior studies and just following the formula that where they come up with what's called the as-if EPS calculation. And the key to that formula is you've got to get the right cost of funds in there, and that can vary because what you might assume as a cost of funds could be different what the firm actually does, right? What actually impacts the firm in terms of the loss, because that can depend on how the firm financed the buyback, right? So my assumption on I use the treasury rate for the cost, but the firm's opportunity cost could be different. So it's not perfect, but it does line up in terms of distinguishing to a reasonable degree the distinction between accredited and non-accredited stock repurchases.
Okay.
Let's go to Sudipta.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Paul. It's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard of you, but I don't think we've ever met in person.
Yeah, we have. No, we have.
Oh, okay. I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Most of these buybacks do result in stock price increases as well, right?
Yes, yes.
So what is the earnings? You know, I would be just how sensitive is the price to the earnings? The earnings goes up by a minuscule amount, as you have shown.
Right.
I'm just wondering what the price to earnings ratio, the change in price to the change in earnings ratio is. I mean, it'll be interesting to see that.
Well, I've got actually at the back of the paper, it's part of the appendix, and we might get to it. I've got some stock price data in there, but the sort of the main finding of that stock price analysis is that there does appear to be a price benefit of a buyback, right? So and that's kind of a motivation, but what I'm saying in this paper is that maybe a price benefit. There could be, agency costs and increased incentive for managerial effort and so forth, a whole bunch of things like that. But we're not seeing that part of the motivation for these things is to manage earnings in the sense that you want to move from a small minus to a small positive. Right. So
I mean, it'd be nice to see if the multiple is 300 or it's 200 or just 20. That's all I was saying.
Yeah, no, we'll go to the couple of the graphs at the end. You can see. I can do it right now. Would you like me to do it right now?
I don't know. Please, if you don't mind.
Okay. All right. So
any time. Yeah, I'll wait. I'm in no rush.
Okay, but just bear with me just a sec. I've got to find this. Hang on. I don't want to mess things up here. Here we go. All right, this is good. Okay, so here's the paper, right? And we're going to go right through the paper. Here we go. We're going to zip through the paper here. And these are some of the ones. And now we go to the appendix. And you can make that bigger. Here we go. Here, right? Okay. So this is the distribution over on the CAR 20 and the CAR -1. So the light green is the CAR over 20 over like a 40-day kind of long term, and the dark green is the CAR -1 to 1. So that's a sort of short-term response. And at the top you see the non-accredits, and the bottom you see the accredits. And one thing to note here, you sort of have to eyeball this, but the accredits percentages are always higher than the non-accredited percentages, right? 2.9, 2.3, 4.1, 3.6, and so forth. And so I read into that there is some benefit stock price wise or return wise from the buybacks that are accredited. These are the ones that we have a high probability they will actually increase in consumer, but not by very much, but there certainly appears to be benefits to stock price. So hopefully that addresses part of that question.
Thank you so much, because it actually strengthens your point. This graph really strengthens the point that you're trying to make. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so while we're on that, anything else, or shall I proceed?
Sudipta has a question. Perhaps we can just.
Yeah. So I was interested in sort of the other things that happen around the buybacks. And one of the main motivations that managers claim is to offset dilution from stock option exercises.
Yep.
Well, if the stock price goes up after buyback, around a buyback, then presumably more managers might exercise options, and that creates a sort of cycle. And
Yep.
so can we really analyze the impact of buybacks without looking at the impact of option exercises?
Yeah, that's, again, part of what's going on with these buybacks is that they are used to offset dilution through stock options and so forth. And I have a paper on that, probably 10 years ago, sort of arguing that the managers are actually benefiting through increased stock values, which is part of their their compensation or accumulated stock that they receive. So that's the case. But I look at that as a sort of agency cost, right? And the question is whether that agency cost is beneficial for the firm or non-beneficial for the firm. So you're paying the managers more, right, and creating dilution. The question is does the firm benefit, or do only certain managers benefit to the exclusion of others? And so I think that's still a sort of a question that's still open in my view. Although a lot of people would argue that buybacks are only designed to favor the few, and the many, or the average shareholder out there is getting screwed. So I don't really know. I don't have a final answer to that. But the SEC in their most recent ruling, we'll come to that also, seems to align with that effect, that there's an unfair distribution by way of these transactions. And again, it's partly, as you said, motivated by the attempts to offset dilution.
Yeah, my point was more about the denominator effect, right? Because when they exercise the options, the number of shares is going to go up. And so now the buyback is reversing that. So, but can we really think about the effect of the denominator in isolation? That's what I had in mind here. Not the agency part so much as the denominator part.
Yeah, no, that's also going on. I agree. And then so when I look at these calculations, I'm only looking at the reduction, not any other issues. I see what you're saying. Yeah, that would that's something what could be another adjustment you make there, right? Because you're offsetting the dilution, so you can incorporate the dilution as an additional variable to in terms of the EPS effect.
Or it's another determinant, but whichever way you think about it.
Yeah. I get it. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. All right. We have one other hand up.
Yes, Paul, thank you. So in this graph, we still appear to have a bunching to just right to the distribution. Like, am I interpreting that correctly? Like bunching just to the right of the distribution. So
are you looking at the slide on the screen at the moment?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So very, very skewed, right? And there's going to be more. There'll be a few more observations out here, but very, very few. Right. These are this is the.
I think he means to the left of the screen. So there's very few to the left of 0 is what he means. So
yeah. Okay. So
yeah.
what you'd think, okay, if we got a perfect in terms of the calculation, because these are accretive, there shouldn't be anything to the left, right? Because it should only be adding EPS. But again, my formula is an approximation. It's not. I'm not actually replicating exactly what the firm did, right? So we should look at that as a potential sort of reflection of a little bit of error in the methodology, but not sufficient to to deny the approach we're using, because only we would deny the approach we're using if there was a huge amount over on the left-hand side here that we were looking at buybacks actually had a negative effect. So we're not seeing that with the accredits. So it kind of supports the expectation of the impact of the buyback. But these are accredited ones. They should be EPS increasing. All right. So Yeah.
Can I have a quick clarifying question? So for this figure, you only report accretive buybacks. Non-accretive buybacks are not included in this graph.
Yeah, there's also on that figure, there's figure 2B, I think, that has the non-accredits, and you see a slight distribution.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the analysis, which is the paper, I look at non-accretive buybacks, and then I also look at earnings activity when there's no buyback whatsoever, right? So we have kind of 3 levels of analysis: accredited buybacks, non-accredited, and everybody else that didn't engage in the buyback. So I can use those sort of call them counterfactors, if you like, to look at these buyback effects. So I'm going to move on to my next slide here. And this requires just a little bit of explanation, but let me proceed to follow along. If the argument is, right, and this is largely coming out of the 3-bar NL paper, the argument is that if earnings if you're expecting the earnings surprise to be just below negative, right, just below, those that engage in buybacks should have a high preponderance of earnings surprises just below 0. All right, and this is the as if EPS, right? Should be well, the as if EPS price should be just below 0. It should be high preponderance, and the others shouldn't have much of a preponderance at all, and so what we're doing here is we're using the accredited buyback sample, so as a treatment sample. We would expect a high degree of positives just below 0, and we're looking at the non-accredited as the counterfactual, where we should expect nothing. Nothing. The distribution shouldn't show that high preponderance. So then we take the difference between the two. So if the argument in the prior research holds, that difference should be positive. Should be more in the accredited and less in the non-accredited, just below 0, should be positive. But if you look at this graph where we take the difference is negative, right? And it's quite strongly negative. You can see around here, this is where it's negative, right? And if it were to support the prior research, those differences should be positive, and they're not. So the graph then is essentially the opposite result of what was found in the use or studied buybacks in the prior period. Now, I have to say also that and I haven't actually tested this, but one of the reasons for that difference could be that the buyback calculation of prior research was based on a very much approximation of what the buyback is, because it's based on just looking at the change in shareholders' equity plus a few adjustments. Whereas what I'm doing is actually looking at true SEC data where the firms actually report the individual buybacks. So the quality of data of what I'm doing is a little better than the quality of what was done in those earlier studies. And I'm not faulting them, because they didn't have this better data at the time. They had to have what they had. They had to do what they do, and so that's what's going on. But the data did change, and the quality did change, and so it's possible that could help explain. But at the same time, it also it's possible that at that time there just happened to be this series of data points, but whether it generalizes to the future, it doesn't look like the case. All right, so that's kind of the point I'm making. That result of the earlier paper does not seem to generalize or it's not reproducible with looking at using better data and applying it to a future period. Okay. The next thing we're sort of talking about in this paper, we're saying, well, these numbers are pretty small, right? And the impact, the EPS impact is pretty small. So the question is, do analysts care about all of this? I mean, is it worth their time and effort to do these sort of calculations of as of EPS and adjust the earnings forecasts is it worth their time and effort to do that and to incorporate what they would expect to be the buyback effect in their earnings forecasts, right? So that would ultimately then affect the earnings surprise at the time of the actual EPS that's reported. So we run a sort of experiment here, and that's based on table 3, right? And if you look at the variables, the first column is the actual earnings surprise, right? This is based on the earnings per share given there was a buyback. So that's the actual earnings surprise. And this is the earnings surprise imputed as if a buyback had not occurred. So we're removing the buyback effect from that earnings surprise. And then we do that for a partition of just looking at the S&P 500 as a separate group. Okay, so here's the result here. And the theory is that if the IBS analyst made no forecast of the EPS boost prior to earnings announcement, made no forecast of the boost, the coefficient for EPS boost in the ES regression, this one here, should be 1, right? Because the full amount is actually in the earnings surprise, and there was no anticipation, no inclusion in the forecast. It should be 1. And if there was, and the other one is the as if you take it out, right? Then the earnings surprise is going to include all of the EPS boost, but this is before that, right? So there shouldn't be any correlation. And so you can see that we get sort of coefficients which confirm the sort of the theory here that we get a coefficient of around about 1 for the actual, and we have a coefficient of essentially 0 for the as if, and then you run this on a subsample with large firms, and it's not perfect, but it's pretty much showing up in the same direction. We also add in some controls and fostering industry fixed effects, year fixed effects, and so forth. And so it's a fairly standard panel regression to get these results. And so the sort of message from this graph then is that analysts don't seem to care, right? I mean, it sort of makes sense. If it's so small, why would they bother, right? And the other thing is that if analysts want to put in a street forecast, a street forecast is sort of, you have to think in terms of the future profitability of the firm, and the future profitability of the firm is probably not dependent on this sort of the level of activity regarding buybacks. So it's going to be more based on more substantive factors, at least in my view. Okay, so let's move on here. It might. Here it is. Here. Okay. All right. Over the months and so forth that they'll be working on this paper, be presenting conferences, and people say, well, here's some suggestions for future research. And so one of the more recent suggestions came up a few months back was, okay, let's see if associated with the buybacks, there's any rounding error. And this gets into the sort of the earnings management literature whereby you look to the digit 4 at the third place after the decimal point, and to see whether there's a sort of reduction in that distribution, because that if there was a reduction, that would suggest there's rounding from 4 to 5 to get the EPS up by 1, basically up by 1 penny, right? 1 additional penny through the rounding. So we run the analysis across. We calculate the EPS ourselves, right? Replicate what the firm is and stuff, but we can calculate it to the third decimal point, so we can see whether we can look at the distribution of 4. So, so you can see here that the first one is we're looking at small negative as if. So these are the ones that potentially could be used to manage earnings, and so we're looking to see if there's any earnings management around 4, and you can see. With the yes, that's the one that more likely than not, it's pretty much a steady distribution across all third digits, right? Third digit of EPS calculation. Then we go into a couple of papers that this is kind of a review paper where they look at suspect buybacks. Those was a as if EPS was minus and the actual EPS was plus. So you identify firms that are in those categories. And the suspect ones, you can see there that there's maybe a little bit of a drop, but mostly just 10% roughly in each category, right? And then we look at the accretive or credits. You can see that there's not much of a change there. So it doesn't seem to be much going on. Then there's a paper by Myers et al. And some others, and they suggest that firms engaging in buybacks are those which have a negative earnings.
Yeah, we have a question. Sorry for interrupting, Paul. I mean, we have a question by Barrett. I think the point is well taken on this.
Yes.
Yeah. Hey,
Please.
hey, Paul. I've got two. Well, one just paper to point you to, and then another kind of question. The first was back to you were talking about the analyst forecasting, and do they kind of anticipate these share repurchases and whatnot? Right. I'm not sure if you've seen, there's a paper by Zach Kaplan, Nathan Marshall, and a couple of other co-authors where they look specifically at forecasts of the numerator and denominator, so in EPS forecast, and they find their results suggest that analysts are kind of strategically forecasting the denominator in the EPS calculation to arrive at what they want that street EPS number to be. And I'm just curious to know how, because you're kind of saying they don't pay attention to it at all, and they have some evidence suggesting they do pay attention in terms of their forecast to the denominator in terms of the forecasted shares outstanding. So this is more just a comment. If you hadn't seen that paper, you might want to look at it and figure out how it kind of jives.
Yeah, I recall sort of vaguely coming across a paper, and I would certainly go take another look. But keep in mind is that we're talking about the overall EPS, not the denominator or the numerator. We're looking at the combination of the two. So you could have a reduction in the denominator, but even so, is that going to change the overall earnings forecast? And particularly on the street side, because the street ones make certain adjustments, and they could take out some of that EPS buyback boost adjustment, because it may not be meaningful in terms of an EPS forecast. It's sort of more indicative of future profitability. But I'll definitely have a look.
I'd have a look, because I don't know, it makes me look at theirs and say, well, why would they expend this time even bothering to forecast?
The
denominator, if you're saying it's so immaterial to overall EPS and whatnot. My second was more just a question, because I'm not super familiar with this space, but these papers that have said, oh, we think share buybacks are a means for earnings management, where has the prior literature typically placed this in like the pecking order of methods you can use to manage earnings? Because this seems like it would be kind of one of your last options, right? It's like, I gotta expend all these resources to repurchase shares just to boost my EPS this maybe one time. I don't know how often I can do this. So I don't know, what does the literature usually have to say? It seems like I totally buy what you're saying, because it seems implausible to me that you'd spend all this effort repurchasing shares just to get a tiny EPS boost one quarter.
Well, thanks, Barrett. It seems like maybe 10 years ago, I don't know exactly on the date, but 10 years ago, it's like everybody was looking for factors which they could associate with managers managing earnings, right? They were just going down the list and trying to get as many different things as possible. And you go to accruals, and you go to non-GAAP and a few other things, but then it showed up in these top journals, Accounting Review, JE, and a couple of top finance journals, where they were coming up with the conclusion that these are kind of association tests. Basically, you're inferring an activity from associations, right? And they were just saying, well, look, my tests indicate that there's earnings management going around these buybacks, and you know, I look at these papers, I've been looking at these papers for years, and sometimes they just don't make sense, you know? You see the result, okay, it holds up, you know, in terms of the test and so forth, but you stand back and you give it a reality test and say, does this really make sense? And the only way to look at that is to sort of repeat the experiment, but it's, you know, it's probably not the case we want to repeat the experiment using the old data, because the old data is not so good. So we repeat the experiment using better data and more up to date. And I would be more than happy to confirm the results, but it just doesn't seem to be holding up. You know, I find this interesting. I think we need a open debate about some of these things. That just because it's published in the top journal, it's not a closed issue, right? And I think the journals need to be more open to having discussions about these issues, because this buyback thing is actually incredibly important, because it's showing up in this very current SEC ruling. That one could look at it and say, this is over-regulation. This is a classic case of over-regulation. They want managers and firms to report. I think they give a 2-day window. They could report all these things almost daily. And if you're a large company, just tracking this and getting the reporting done, that's a pretty large effort. And as you'll see in I think in my last slide, there's a Court of Appeals decision just came out a couple of weeks ago, or no, actually October, a couple of months ago, rejecting the SEC ruling. Let me show you that slide a little later on. But it's important that we look at these things, because there are policy implications, right? And so it's significant. But anyway, I've said enough on that. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Sorry. I just want to get a peeve off my chest. There are some of these stories that are interesting. Maybe they're true occasionally in practice, but backing them up with statistics is quite another tale, you know, and I think that people don't really take the difference between this seriously enough. Anyway, having got my pet peeve off my chest, I'll sign out.
All right. Thank you. Derek.
Yeah, hi. So just along the lines of sort of Barrett's question about where this lands in the pecking order, and I don't know if you discussed this at all in the paper, but if you don't, it might be worthwhile highlighting that, at least on the surface, buybacks seem like they would be probably one of the least efficient tools to manage earnings, because you weight the shares that are outstanding at a period of time. And at best, you're probably not going to know how far you're going to be away from the earnings surprise till late in the year, probably very late in the year. So because of that weighting, you would have to make enormous buybacks to have it have any effect. And I mean, I think from all the tables and graphs you've shown, that's become very obvious, but at least sort of just a theoretical discussion of, at the beginning, this seems like a very inefficient tool, because by the time you realize that you're not going to be at the earnings you expect, you're not going to really be able to buy back enough shares to make any difference anyways.
Well, yeah, Derek, I mean, your point is well made, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the question I ask is your point is pretty obvious, right? But why wasn't that point made 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? And so that's what you know, somebody needs to come up and sort of make it clear that something should have been said earlier. There's reasons that it is a sort of a second order or even third order activity if you're going to do that sort of thing. So you're absolutely on point, right? But just because it's below water, I still feel obligated to write, you know, what we've done here to sort of put out there potentially in the literature, you know, a counterpoint to the view that's out there. And as I said, I view this as important because the general impression in the literature and now in policy is that buybacks have a sort of pejorative tone to them, and I'm not sure whether that should be the case or not.
Yeah, I think quick question. I mean, I'm gonna cut the line a little bit, but I think there is a paper by Alex Edmonds from FBS, and also Robert Jackson. Robert Jackson also has some papers. So basically, they have an interesting evidence in which they show that whenever you have a repurchase announcement, a buyback announcement, right after the fact, right after the announcement, a lot of basically when the company announced that he's gonna buy shares, so you will understand there could be some possibility of undervaluation. A lot of executives sell stocks. So to some extent, I mean, there are a lot of possibilities for this to be for liquidity reason, for diversification reason. I mean, they don't claim that it's a manipulation. But obviously, there is kind of like a disconnect between you say that this is undervalued and then you sell it. So in my view, I think this paper in this respect is very, it's very well timed, because the policy was not thinking about, managing the earnings. The policy was thinking that there is something weird happening here. It may be that nothing's happening, but at least you have to disclose why you are selling or exactly the dates in which you are selling the stocks and the versus the announcement. So in my view, once I saw that, I think that it claims this question, actually, is there any manipulation? It's just a coincidence. It could be just a, mispricing. It could be, I don't know. So I think that there's some evidence there that begs for this paper to be written.
I mean, a couple of points there. One is that some of these results that were published in good journals, right? It could be just the result of the tail of distribution, and so you have to be careful that you're getting sort of a narrative out there that policymakers seem to be paying attention to that is a function of the tail of distribution. I think we've got to be really careful about that. To your other point, you raised the Edmonds, and I know he's done some work on buybacks. He did it. I think it's a monograph coming out of London Business School. So I read that, and what's interesting is that there's a couple of his calculations actually wrong, right? He's a finance guy, not an accountant, so I understand that finance people don't always know their accounting, and of course, vice versa, accountants don't always know their finance. So I understand that. But I wrote to him and I said, well, I don't think you've got this calculation right. Never heard back. So I don't know if he got my email or not. But as I said, that was just some work that's done there on the finance side on the valuation aspect, and the valuation aspect does seem to be real. There do seem to be positive increases overall in general. That's not what we're talking about this paper. That's all. Okay, I'm going to exploit the last few minutes here to try to get through everything. Looking at table 7. All right, looking at table 7, this is part of table 7, the second part, and what we're doing here is we're only looking at the very small number of buybacks that are greater than 1%, right? That's that right tail of the distribution, and so these are the big ones. We call them big ones, and you can see there that for the very small number, the 90 out of thousands, right? We do get what would appear to be some rounding error. All right, so you can see that percentage, the 4. So these are, and then there's a higher percentage. See from the 4 to the 5. You see right there. Although it doesn't change that much for the late that's just partitioning on time. So there's possibility that a very small number of buybacks create an earnings per share that's like 1 cent higher than it should be, right? Through the rounding error. So we're not basically saying we can't rule this out entirely, but this is basically, like the exception more than anything else. Let me go to we already looked at this. I remember I told you that on the market reaction, this is a -20 to 20 and a -1 to 1. The accretive buybacks, if you look at the percentages, they're always slightly higher. So that's the sort of the share price effect that we already mentioned. And so I've got 2 more slides here. Let's go to the conclusion. Just to recap, buybacks do not offer an alternative explanation of the growing trend of positive earnings surprises. So that's the sort of negative result. We're ruling that out. There's no evidence to support the use of credit buybacks to manage earnings, particularly this is going from them slightly just below 0 to slightly above 0. Analysts don't seem to care. In other words, there's no evidence, at least not picking up evidence, that they actually impound forecasts of EPS buyback effect in their street forecast. And then our evidence has an implication for this new release coming out of the SEC 3497424. And I'm going to go to my next slide, which is the final slide, but potentially, I think, important here, and that is that in October, the U.S. Court of Appeals found fault with that release. Remember, that release is going to have daily reporting on buybacks, and within 2 days, I think you had to report a buyback, and that's applying to all the SEC regimes. So it's a pretty big deal. And they issued a decision to remand. And remand means basically, it's a legal term, but it kind of means send it back to the drawing board. You got to redo this thing. It hasn't done right. So be remanded back to the SEC to correct the rules. And the justification, the argument in that opinion is that the SEC release was arbitrary and capricious, right? And then I quote, that it was opportunistic or improperly motivated buybacks are not genuine problems. So the court came to the view that opportunistic or improperly motivated buybacks, maybe there are some, but they're not genuine problems and they don't warrant this SEC rule. So right now, under the remand, firms are still reporting on this rule, so they still have to follow it. They haven't changed. But we'll have to see what the SEC does in terms of potentially changing this rule to make it consistent with the way the courts, because if they don't change it sufficiently, then it's going to come back to the courts, and you never know what could happen from that. So those are just some references. So I'm going to say thank you so much for all of you. This has been a fantastic discussion. Obviously, I'm going to take a look at the recording, and I appreciate any other remarks. So here I am. It's 10:28, so that's not too bad. 2 minutes. 2 minutes before the deadline, but any other comments? And I apparently, I think Young wanted me to talk about the next one. So let me just use my time on that. Oh,
yeah,
yeah. Deepak has a question. Yeah.
Okay, question. Okay, please.
So, the switch from negative to positive earnings surprises happened in '93. Larry Brown has a paper on this, in '97, he published in '97.
Yeah.
But that's the year in which basically stock options took off because the salary stopped being deductible, right? And presumably that's also when these stock buybacks increased in volume. I don't know. I haven't studied that far back. I do know that stock options took off in '93. And that's when the switch happened. So, looking at it today may not, there may be new factors that affect this today, but, the distribution, but the switch itself happens in '93, and there's tied to the stock options and buyback. So just a, side note.
Yeah, no, look, I appreciate that very much. And I may have underplayed or under reasoned that particular aspect, but as I said in the paper, I mean, generally, there are lots of reasons for buybacks, and some of them are very legitimate, well-motivated, and perfectly fine, and, this notion that they're driven by changing the stock options is totally acceptable to me. But that's another reason. It's not the earnings management motivation, which is that's where I'm sort of focused on here, and in large way I'm focused on that because the narrative in the literature is different to what I'm finding in this result. So I feel I've got to just say something.
All right, so I think time's up. I would just like to remind people that, March 5th, we have another paper by Donnie Zhao. It's called You Have a Point, but a point is not enough. The case for distributional forecasts of earnings. Okay, so, I think that's, Derek has a question. I don't know if this is out of time, but, I think we are up to you. Okay.
That was an inadvertent hand raise. Sorry about that.
Okay, so sounds perfect. Okay, thank you very much to everybody, and talk to you in